Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the 4th Annual Nell Ward Lecture. We are thrilled to have you here tonight. I'm Lisa Perry Richardson. I'm the Director of Advancement here for the History Center. What a wonderful crowd, so many old friends, longtime supporters, members, trustees, and some new faces. We are so excited to have you here in Tico Hall, as well as our virtual audience online. So welcome to you all. Thank you for coming. Several years ago, we chose to name this lecture in honor of the generosity of one of our very good friends and great History Center supporter, Nell Ward. Nell's passion for Florida history and appreciation for maps and the role they play in bringing that history to life have inspired her support over the years. I'd like to recognize Nell now and invite her to tell you more about her support for this program. Nell.
With my teaching career having spanned multiple areas, one of which was social studies, I felt like I would like nothing better than to sponsor this annual lecture on cartography. The deciding factor was Tom Touchton, without whom we would not have had the Tampa Bay History Center. His contributing his extensive map collection to this institution made my decision to sponsor this lecture series on cartography a no-brainer. My deep appreciation to everyone at the Tampa Bay History Center, in particular, Rodney Kite-Powell, Director of the Touchton Map Library, C.J. Roberts, President and CEO of the History Center, and Lisa Perry Richardson, Chief Development Officer, who had a hand in making this wonderful event possible for us to enjoy this evening. Thank you.
Nell, thank you for your kind words and your tremendous support. We are forever grateful for you. Now I'd like to introduce two individuals who really don't need much introduction. Collectively, their knowledge of Florida maps is unrivaled. You are in for a real treat tonight. Tom Touchton, as most of you know, was the driving force behind the creation of the Tampa Bay History Center. He spent more than 2 decades providing leadership, raising funds, and working to ensure that Tampa and Hillsborough County have one of the best history museums in the country. And along with that, building a world-class collection of historic Florida maps, which now comprise the core collection of the Touchton Map Library and Florida Center for Cartographic Education. Rodney Kite-Powell serves as the director of the Touchton Map Library here at the History Center and is also a well-known local historian and Hillsborough County's county historian as well. He's also served the Tampa Bay History Center as our longest-serving employee, having worked for the History Center now for over 30 years. I'm not sure he wanted me to share that, but we are. Please join me in welcoming Tom Touchton and Rodney Kite-Powell, this year's Nell Ward Lecturers.
Well, thank you all so much for being here. My name is Rodney Kite-Powell.
I'm Tom Touchton.
And so before we get going too far into our program, we do want to clear up maybe a slight maybe misconception. The email notice that we sent out yesterday had a slightly erroneous title. The announcement that you all got when you first signed up here had the right title for the show. But the email yesterday included a reference to the exhibit that we have in the Touchton Map Library, Mapping the American Sea, the history of the Gulf of Mexico through maps. And we didn't want you all to think that we're exclusively doing that, although that was inspired by the book that Tom is holding up, the Jack Davis A History of the Gulf, which is History of the American Sea. I will say we didn't steal the title from Jack of the American Sea, and we named the exhibit that before January 20th. And so, but interestingly, neither Jack nor the current president is the one who has attached that name to the Gulf of Mexico. It actually, off and on, had been referred to as the American Sea. If you think about it, it is a gulf or a sea that is surrounded by the Americas, North America and South America. And so it's as maybe unusual as we may think of the title now, it's not entirely without historic precedent. So to get into what we're going to talk about today, and this we're going to assume this is going to work. It does. Just kind of start off with a question. What is the Touchton Map Library, or what are the Touchton Map Library and the Florida Center for Cartographic Education, other than very, very long titles? Well, so the TML and the FCCE, in basic terms, is a department within the History Center where we use maps and atlases and other cartographic materials to help us tell the story of Florida and Florida history. And you know, exhibits like Mapping the American Sea and others are a way that we use the collection to educate. But we also have a collection. We have over 6,000 cartographic items in the collection. Again, the vast majority collected by Tom, which is what you're going to learn about today. As part of that, part of our story is how Tom became a collector and what his experiences were. We also had a collection in the History Center and with the Hillsborough County Historic Commission prior to Tom's transfer of his collection, so that's why it's a little more than what they had. But other than a few prime maps, the pre-existing collection was very pedestrian. Tom's collection has obviously made it world class. We also foster research in a variety of topics, of course, utilizing that collection. We curate exhibits using that collection, although we do sometimes borrow maps from other institutions as well. And then we continue to add to the collection. Again, thank you very much to Tom and others who help us with that. We actually add 80 to 100 maps every year. And you think, my gosh, we have 6,000. How do we find more to buy? And Lisa even says, why do you keep buying them? I'm raising money, but you keep spending it. But that's what collections do to survive, is they do need to grow a bit. And we're going to talk a little bit about how there are still maps available for us to acquire after all the time Tom has spent adding to the collection. And then finally, one of the things we do is we follow a digitization and conservation plan that helps ensure that the collection will be accessible and stable, of course, for as long as we can possibly do so. And that is an important distinction as well. The last thing is providing access. So access, of course, for researchers that are here, but with the digitization allows us to have the maps on our website, so they're available for people around the world if they have internet access. And one thing I didn't put is the Touchton Map Library is one of about 12 to 14 cartographic centers in the whole country, and really the only one in the Southeast. The other ones closer, that are kind of close to us, would be the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C., and there's a great map collection at University of Texas in the Austin campus. But other than that, the rest of them are either in the Northeast or the Midwest, and there's one out at Stanford University. So that is what we are, and so I turn it over to Tom to talk about who he is.
Thank you, Rodney. Well, Rodney and I have spent a lot of time getting ready for this evening, trying to think about what you would like to hear. And so we're going to spend about 20 minutes with my describing, I hope well, my life as a map collector. And then for about 20 minutes, Rodney is going to share with us some images from the collection and some comments about many of those images. And then the last 15 or 20 minutes, we'll have Q&A from you all. So be prepared to ask questions, and Rodney and I will do our best to answer them. But before we get to my comments and the images, I obviously want to thank Nell Ward, who called me a dozen or so years ago and said, you know that endowed lecture that you want to have for the map library? And I said, yes. She said, I would like to make a gift to name it. So Nell, thank you again for doing that. This is the 4th Nell Ward Lecture, and we hope you enjoy it. And Nell, I hope you particularly enjoy it. I also want to thank you all in the audience for being here, for supporting the History Center, for being interested in maps. Some of you, I won't try to name you all who are here, but some of you have been involved and interested in the Tampa Bay History Center for the 36 years that it has been since this effort really began seriously. I would also ask, this is a little unusual, If you are a present or past board member, or a present or past docent, or a present or past staff member, would you please stand up? And I'll tell you why in a minute. Stand up if you're a past board member, okay, docent, trustee. Thank you. The reason I wanted to tell you that is some of you may not have seen the recent announcement that USA Today recently named the Tampa Bay History Center as one of the 10 best history museums in America. And if I had to ask on the donors to the History Center to stand up, I think you'd all stand up. So thank you for that. There's one recognition that I wish I could make and one expression of thanks that I definitely will make. The acknowledgement that I'd hoped to make tonight would have been to Jim McDougall, who was our Nell Ward Lecturer 2 years ago. He was not able to come at the last minute. But Jim, who lives in St. Petersburg, has done some incredible research about early Spanish exploration of the west coast of Florida and the Tampa Bay area in particular. And I just wanted to say, I think the research he has done will be history changing. I mean that, and that you all will hear more about that in due course. Sorry, Jim, if you're watching, I'm sorry you can't be with us tonight. The special expression of thanks that I wanted to give was to C.J. Roberts, who is not here tonight because, would you believe, he has COVID. So C.J. has been our president CEO for 20 years. He has been our leader and led the effort to design and build the Tampa Bay History Center, and has been the president CEO, the only permanent president CEO we've ever had. And you may have also not seen the recent announcement that we are losing CJ because the governor of North Carolina has invited CJ and has appointed CJ to go to Raleigh, North Carolina to be the director of the 8 history museums in the state of North Carolina and to manage a roughly $150 million capital budget, which includes rebuilding the State History Museum for North Carolina. So we hate to lose CJ. He's been a great leader. The staff and the donors and the friends of the History Center love CJ and his wife Sarah and daughter Livy, but he said he had one more project in his life in his mid-50s. I think he has several more. And we wish CJ well, and I suspect, CJ, you're watching tonight, so we wish you well, and all of us want to thank you for your leadership. Let's do that. So I am 86 years old, and that is a number that is important for this presentation only because I started collecting maps when I was 43. So I have now spent exactly half of my life as a collector of Florida maps. But perhaps this is a good time to tell you that I am a cartophile and not a cartophiliac. But I need to tell you what that means. I was asked to make some comments to a group in New York several years ago, and I said, now what is somebody like me called who likes maps, collects maps, loves maps, studies maps? I said, I think it's cartophile, but I better look that up. So I went to the Urban Dictionary and I looked up cartophile, and sure enough, that's what I am. But there was a word right next to it, cartophiliac, and I made a note of what that word was, and sure enough, at the end of my comments in New York, one of the gentlemen stood up and said, so does that mean you're a cartophiliac? And I said, well, fortunately, it does not mean that, because the Urban Dictionary defines a cartophiliac as someone who steals grocery carts from a Publix or a Winn-Dixie or a CVS parking lot and turns them back into management for a reward. So I can tell you that I am a cartophile. I am not a cartophiliac. So I bought my first Florida map in the fall of 1982 when my wife Lee and I were in London for one of her important birthdays, one of those that ends in a 0. Lee, during her lifetime, was a great supporter of the History Center and of this map collection. And Lee and I went to a neighborhood antique fair one Saturday morning, and I was always looking for booksellers, but there were no booksellers there, but there was a young man in the back of the room with maps pinned on the wall, and I said, "What are you selling?" And he said, "I sell maps." And I asked the very intelligent question, "Who buys maps?" Well, he spent about an hour talking with me about maps and their historic significance, the artistic nature of them, their role in political negotiations for centuries, and I was absolutely hooked by what he had to tell me about maps. And it's one of those things that I knew was going to lead to something more important. And I bought from him this issue in September of 1982 of The Map Collector, which is a magazine for map collectors. Imagine that. In the back of that, or the inside cover of that map collector was an advertisement for Jonathan Potter. And so I knew his shop was just several blocks from our hotel. So I said, let's go over and see what a map dealer does. So we went over there on Monday morning, and I walked in and introduced myself to Jonathan Potter and said, "I wonder if you can help me. I'm going to collect maps." And he said, "Yes, I think I can help you with that." And he said, "What are you going to collect?" Well, I thought the map business was this big. I did not know the map business was this big. So I said again intelligently, "Well, I'm just going to collect maps." And I don't remember if his eyes rolled or not, but he was a polite Englishman, and he said, "Well, I think you'll decide at some point that you'll specialize on a period of time or a particular cartographer or a geographical area as a way to narrow your focus." And I said, "Well, Lee and I are from Florida, and we live in Florida, and Florida has an important history." Didn't know much about it. Florida has an important history, and we live there. So I said, "I'll collect Florida maps." So I bought our first several Florida maps from Jonathan Potter, who gave me this catalog that he had just published in the fall of 1982, which had, I think the number is 556 maps described. Several of the maps described in this catalog are now upstairs in the Tampa Bay History Center. So a few maps became a few dozen maps, became a few hundred maps, became several thousand maps. And when we say it's a Florida collection, it doesn't have to be just Florida, but it can be the Southeast, and you'll see why in a few minutes. Florida was the name in the Southeast for a very long time. Or it can be a North American map that is important for Florida history for some reason. But those of you who are collectors of anything understand have a collecting disease. And I'm afraid I got that disease that day. That's a mosquito. A Florida mosquito, imagine that. But you may hear, if Rodney's really on it, you may hear about Mosquito County in a few minutes. Absolutely. But I'll let Rodney deal with that. So my interest in maps really has changed quite a bit since I used to go to Ramsey's Gulf Oil Station in Dade City when I was growing up. And like many of us did, you could walk into a gas station and there was a rack of maps, and you could take a map of Florida, or Alabama, or Georgia, North Carolina. You could take maps out of the rack, and because either the dealer provided them or Gulf Oil provided them. But it's changed a lot since then. I I know that many of you did the same thing. I also wonder how many of you have said to me that you got your love affair with maps started when you were in the back seat of your family car and you had a paper map unfolded and you were trying to tell your father or your mother to turn here, to take this road or whatever, and that was your introduction to maps. Well, of course, now it's Google Maps and GPS systems, so I think this new generation is missing a lot, but I'm going to let them worry about that. But I was very fortunate as a collector because the map business, if I may refer to it that way, really began to expand in the 1970s and early 80s, and with more dealers, more map dealers, and more customers, and more publications, and more map auctions from the major auction houses. So it just happened that I began my interest in maps at a time, if you think of a pyramid, when that pyramid was really starting to expand. The act of collecting maps then caused me to have an increased interest in Tampa area, Bay Area where I lived, for the state of Florida, which has a great history, and that really put me in a frame of mind, you might say. So in 1988, 6 years after I started collecting maps, I responded favorably when Jim Furman and Herbert McKay and Leland Hawes, who was the history editor for the Tribune, as some of you will recall, they asked me if I would take over the leadership of a historical museum task force, which the county commissioners had created, but the chairman had been transferred to Texas, and they were without a chairman. And they said, would you be the chairman of this task force? And I said I would do that, thinking that it would take 3 or 4 years and $3 or $4 million to build a history museum. Well, I was wrong about that too. It took 20 years and $53 million, and where you are today is the result of the effort of so many of you in this room. And I think of George Howell, who was very involved, and Sullivan O'Neill, who was very involved, and Nancy Skimp. Kay Heller is here. Kay was one of the original trustees. Bill Lazarus is here. Bill Lazarus was a trustee. Dave Murphy, whose granddaughter is here with her husband. Dave Murphy and his wife Ann were great supporters of the History Center. There have been so many people who came together because they recognized the value of history to this community and to the state of Florida, and they helped make all of this happen. I did not know that during my 43 years of collecting, my interest would take me to libraries all over the U.S. and sometimes in England and once to France to look at map libraries there, to look at their Florida map collections. And I also did not know that I would meet so many other collectors and librarians and map curators at museums all over the country, and I'm sure they were all cartophiles and not cartophiliacs. It is important to say that there are several hundred map reference books that are in my library at home, and that is an image of, you might say, 2/3 of my library at home, and every piece of paper that you see there either is about maps or Tampa Bay history or Florida history, and it'll all come to the History Center, except for the articles, which they may already have, and Rodney may say, please don't do that. But the map reference books have already begun to come here, and if we had a shot of the other direction, which I didn't think to do, you would have seen bookcases full of map reference books and flat files where the maps that are now upstairs used to live. Two of the books that Rodney and I decided to bring tonight, Philip Burden is a map dealer who lives just outside of London. And he started 25 years ago to write these 2 volumes about the mapping of North America. This is huge. Okay?
Literally huge.
The combination of these books is 1,008 pages, and they cover maps of North America from 1511, and Rodney's going to refer to map number 1 in the Philip Burden books. And Philip Burden gave up writing about the mapping of North America when he wrote about maps in 1700. Well, he didn't write them in 1700. He wrote about maps published in 1700. So in 189 years, Philip Burden wrote about almost 1,000 maps of North America. If he had tried to do volume 3 and 4, which he said he just couldn't do, it would have been thousands or tens of thousands of maps of North America, of which the earliest maps in here are about Florida, because Florida has the earliest history in North America. Thank you, Rodney.
My workout for the day.
So another, we mentioned 2 more. Susan Shillington was the first Nell Ward lecturer 4 years ago. These are 2 of the books she has written, Mapping the Nation and America in 100 Maps. They're just map reference books, of which we have a lot. And then the third one, I mentioned Jim McDougall a few minutes ago. These are 3 of the books that Jim McDougall has written about Spanish exploration of the west coast of Florida. And then finally, this is a 5-volume set. Each of the volumes are about the size of the Philip Burden books, the history of cartography, and the editor of those 5 volumes was Matthew Edney, who was last year's Nell Ward lecturer. And what I didn't know, again, as a collector of maps, that I would, as I visited these other libraries and saw their collections of Florida maps, that I would find collections of Florida maps at the University of Florida in Gainesville, in the Smathers Library, the P.K. Young part of the Smathers Library at the University of Florida, the Florida State Archives, the Florida Historical Society in Cocoa, the American Antiquarian Society in Worcester, Mass., the British Library in London, the American Geographical Society in Milwaukee, and I could name about 9 other locations, New York, Boston, Chicago, San Francisco. They all have Florida map collections, and they have many maps that we wish we had. And maybe someday copies of what they have will turn up, and if they do, we will try to acquire them for the Tampa Bay History Center. But the number of Florida maps that are not in our already sizable collection is surprisingly large, and they are small towns and developments that happened and developments that didn't happen, and communities that started and failed, or that started and were very successful. And there are some wonderful maps, particularly from the late 1800s when the railroad began coming to Florida and was growing all the time. And you might see 6 particular maps, railroad maps of a particular publisher, and you would say, well, they all look the same. Well, they aren't the same, because as you look at each of those side by side, you'll see that each year the railroad went a little bit farther down the state. And if we saw a particular map of Colton or Mitchell or anybody who did railroad maps, and we saw that railroad went another 10 miles that year and went to not just to Winter Park, but maybe to Orlando, or went to Kissimmee, or went to Palm Beach or Fort Lauderdale or Miami, we will add those maps to the collection to make it as complete as we can make it. 2 last comments before Rodney starts his show and tell. There are 2 points that I really wish we would all keep in mind that I'd really never sort of thought about until I was preparing for this talk. One is that the discovery of Florida and the New World by Christopher Columbus in 1492, That happened about 50 years after the invention of printing using movable type by Gutenberg, right? Well, the invention of printing by movable type created an explosion in a demand for books, even at a time when not as many people read then as read now. But there was an explosion of demand for books, and that was soon followed by an explosion of a demand for published maps. And it just happens that the discovery of Florida and the New World happened 50 years after the invention of printing, not 100 or 200 years before that, when we might not have had the history that we have. The second point I would make is Florida is a relatively new state. While it was named by Ponce de Leon in 1513, the Spanish didn't do too much with Florida for a couple of hundred years. Then Great Britain owned Florida for 20 years, and then the Spanish owned it again, and then it belonged to Spain for another 30 or 40 years. Then it became a territory in 1821 and a state in 1845. But it was after the Civil War and the Seminole Wars in the 1800s that so many people began moving to Florida. What that means is that the history of this new state, which was the last frontier east of the Mississippi River, the last frontier of America east of the Mississippi River, going in 170 years to being the third most populous state in the United States. That history is well documented, and the stories are well told through maps, including the maps here at the History Center that Rodney is now going to talk about.
Wow, thank you. Thank you, Tom, and he's not done yet, so, but I do get my turn to talk to you guys a little bit, and so really kind of the point of my part of the show is to show you guys, and Tom, will definitely be part of it as well, show you guys, really the kind of breadth and depth of the map library's collection. We have 6,000 again or so cartographic items in all different forms, again, printed single sheet maps, maps and atlases, globes, not very many, but a couple of those, topographical maps, transportation maps, war maps, peace maps, all kinds of maps. Maps aren't even maps, whether it's plates or cups or tablecloths, all different kinds of things that all have Florida on them. Or as Tom said, Florida being this great gateway between the Caribbean and the West Indies and the mainland North America, the collection also includes the Southeast, includes the Caribbean, includes lots of maps of places like Cuba, so many so that we actually did an exhibit on Cuba using the maps in the collection. And so again, some of the things I kind of wrote down some notes. Maps appear in magazines, newspapers. They really help tell the story of what has happened, where you're going, and in a sense, where you've also been. And we also are kind of fond of saying that the map collection itself has really helped put Tampa and the History Center itself on the map. And so it really is an incredibly important collection and really incredibly important for us. We'll start with what we call the Big Three. The Big Three. And that's these three maps. These are all fairly recent acquisitions in the History Center's collection. Top left is the Peter Martyr map from 1511. Top right is the Hernán Cortés map from 1524, and the bottom is the Batista Boazio map of 1586 of St. Augustine. So we'll go one at a time. The first one, the oldest one, is the Peter Martyr map of 1511, the first printed map at least, to show any part of Florida, and that's what's here. It's actually identified as the island or part of the island of Bimini, but it is due north of Cuba, and the language on the back of the sheet talks about this landmass to the north of Cuba. This is 2 years before Juan Ponce de Leon came to and named Florida. He was actually looking for Bimini, and that's what is identified right there. You want to say something?
Just a story. The reason we have this map is because a collector friend of mine, Art Holzheimer, and his wife Jan used to visit Tampa to see relatives every year after the Miami Map Fair in February. And so Art and Jan were at the Tampa Bay History Center at the Columbia Cafe several times over the years. And one year when Rodney and I were having lunch with Art, Art said, "I'm in the process of disposing of my collection." Art and Jan lived in Chicago. He said, "I'm giving most of it to the Newberry Library in Chicago, but the Peter Martyr map in my collection ought to be here." So this is map number 1 in the Philip Burden books, and it is a gift to the Tampa Bay History Center from Art and Jan Holzheimer.
Exactly. Thank you, Tom. So the next map in our chronological order is the Hernán Cortés map. This is how it appears tipped into the book. The Gulf of Mexico, which is the part we care about, is upside down, so we can turn it over. And we see just above me is where it is. The image on the left is Tenochtitlan, or what is now Mexico City. This is the first printed map, or really probably first map of any kind, that shows any city in North America. But again, we care about it because of this part. It is the most accurate map of the Gulf of Mexico up to that date, again, printed in 1524, and the first printed map with the name Florida, La Florida, located right here on the Florida Peninsula. They have the line going all the way to the edge, so they knew it was a peninsula. They actually thought it was an island before. But this is an incredibly significant map, and we just had acquired this about a year and a half ago through the generosity of Tom and Nell and Nancy and Bob Bolt. So we are thrilled to be able to have added this to our collection.
Okay, just to repeat, this is the first printed map in history on which the name Florida appears. There are maybe 15 copies in the world. We think it is the only copy in Florida, and it is here because, as Rodney said, Nancy and Bob and Nell and I were able to negotiate an acceptable price before the dealer took it to the New York Antiquarian Book Fair to mark it up and sell it to somebody else.
And then last only in order is this, the Battista Boazio map, or view of St. Augustine, the first view of any city in the United States, dated 1586, and it depicts Sir Francis Drake's raid. He wasn't Sir Francis Drake at the time, but Francis Drake's raid on St. Augustine. And then, again, this one was purchased through the generosity of several folks who are in this room. Ada Jean Sampson, I know, is here. Duncan Belser is here. Several others, Tom, of course.
If you look at the upper right, there's that St. Augustine there where Rodney's blinker is, and just to the right of that is S. Augustine, meaning St. Augustine. So this is the first appearance on a printed map of an American city. The map is well known and often appears in a catalog, or a calendar, that you might see in a bookstore in a colored version. But we believe this is the first state of this map. I was going to say, the reason this map was done is Sir Francis Drake had just circumnavigated the globe and became Queen Elizabeth I's sort of favorite sea captain. And one day she called him in and said, I don't know how she said it, but Sir Francis, go give the Spanish a hard time. So this was the British sea captain, Sir Francis Drake, who first went to the coast of Spain and sacked and burned one city. Then he came to the West Indies and did several more, including Cartagena in Colombia. And then he was on his way to Roanoke Island in Virginia to pick up some British settlers. And they were passing by St. Augustine. He said, oh, let's go sack and burn St. Augustine. So these are Sir Francis Drake's ships there. It's hard to tell, but those are his soldiers walking across the island, and then some more boats. They're attacking St. Augustine, and those are the British moving into the lower right side of St. Augustine, while the Spanish settlers from St. Augustine are on their way out at the upper left. Great story.
Absolutely. And each one of these three maps is one of a dozen or so that are known to exist in the world. And as Tom pointed out, there likely is not a copy of the Cortés map in Florida. When you look at institutions that have all three, there are less than 10 institutions in this country that have all three of those. And again, very few people have all three if you look about worldwide. So we are incredibly fortunate to have been able to assemble those big three maps. They help us tell greatly important stories about Florida's early history, Florida's place in early American history. And so we are thrilled to be able to have them. But they are 3 of 6,000. We're not going to show you all 6,000. But you can go online and look at all 6,000 if you like. I know. Next time. But we do want to get going with a little bit more. So other important, so we have lots of firsts. So we just went through some firsts. So here are some more firsts. So we're going to whip through these pretty quickly. But again, they are all available. And again, this lecture not only is being shown live virtually, but it also is being recorded. And so if you'd like to go back and see this again, you can go to our website and you can see it, or go to our YouTube channel, and you'll be able to see it and pause and do all kinds of things.
Because you need to prepare for the pop quiz that's coming at the next session.
Exactly, exactly. And if anybody actually is watching live at home, you can type up some questions when we get to Q&A at the end. So, but anyway, other important firsts within the collection. The first map of Tampa. And I have to use the word legitimate because there was a guy named, oh my God, I just lost his name, Augustus Steele, who was the first judge in Tampa, who created kind of an illegitimate map because he was selling land that didn't belong to him. But this is the first legitimate, first legal map of Tampa, printed in 1847. It's a manuscript map, so it wasn't printed. It's a manuscript map created by John Jackson. And it shows the layout of the grid that became downtown Tampa. Very few changes from a street name standpoint, and really even from the street width. The way the streets were laid out are very similar to how they are today. It also includes the owners of property. The map was commissioned by the Hillsborough County Commissioners as a way to sell town lots in the new county seat of Hillsborough County. Hillsborough County had been created in 1834, so this is 13 years later. But they wanted to build a courthouse. So they wanted to sell land to raise money to build the courthouse, so they had to have a map to sell the land to get the money. And so that's why John Jackson did this. So we also have what we believe to be the first map of the city of Jacksonville. This is from 1859. And a really fun feature of this is this road here, the extension of, I think that's Monroe, which is how one would get to the town of Alligator, which was soon changed to Lake City. And Alligator wasn't named after alligators, the animal, but named after Alligator, kind of capital A Seminole leader. And then they had just finished the fight in the Seminole Wars, and they realized you're not going to get a lot of people moving here if they think this is a Seminole village. And so they changed the name to Lake City.
Story. So road to Alligator, which is today's Lake City. And Alligator, as Rodney said, was named for an Indian leader nearby, and the people didn't like that very much. So they had to petition the Florida legislature to change the name from Alligator to something. And apparently one of the wags in the legislature said, well, why don't they just change it to Crocodile? But it ended up being Lake City.
Yeah. Another first is first, or at least first available, first obtainable map of the city of Fort Myers from 1886. And it includes the Thomas Edison Laboratory, which was in full swing at that time. He was here. One of the reasons why he came here is he thought that the palm fiber in palm trees would make for a good filament for light bulbs. We have the first map of St. Petersburg, printed in 1889. St. Petersburg founded by Peter Dimmins, named for his hometown in Russia. And he was the owner of the Orange Belt Railroad, so he needed to have he wanted to have a railhead, so he did so on the shores of Tampa Bay by in creating St. Petersburg. Henry Plant bankrupted him and bought his railroad line, and really it's because of that St. Petersburg has a very public waterfront rather than a very industrial waterfront, because Henry Plant only wanted one industrial waterfront, and that was here in Tampa. We also have what is likely the very first map of the city of Miami. Certainly the first map that was produced by the city. The city engineer, a guy named Frederick, created this map in 1905, so just 9 years after the establishment or the incorporation of Miami. And then this was a fun thing, which is also Miami, Miami Beach, the first map, certainly of Florida, if not of anywhere in the country, to show airplanes, to include airplanes. And you see there's one here, and there are actually some on the beach here. And this ocean beach in 1912 became Miami Beach following World War II, or World War I, excuse me. All right, now so we have maps of exploration. We have this map from 1493. It's the map of the known world prior to the information of Columbus's voyage going by. And you could ask, and we will, why would we have a map that doesn't even show the New World, much less Florida?
The reason this 1493 map is here, which was 20 years or 21 years before Christopher Columbus came here, because this was the world known to Europeans at the time of Columbus's voyage. And I thought it would be an appropriate map to have in the collection, to sort of the before and the after, so to speak.
So we go from 1493 to 1540, the Herman Munster map of what we now know as North and South America, the first printed map to show those two joined together. This wonderful manuscript map, which is not in our collection, so there are some that we have to just use facsimiles. This is in the John Carter Brown Library collection, but this is by Antonio Velasco from 1584, and it is the very first map of any kind to have the name Tampa on it. B de Tampa, the Bay of Tampa, right where it's supposed to be. And it's, again, we don't know the origin of the word Tampa. We could spend far too much time talking about that. But suffice to say, 1584 is when Tampa really, literally first appeared on the map. Then we go to Geronimo Chaves and the Abraham Ortelius Atlas from 1584, the first time Florida is kind of its own map without other stuff around it, which is very kind of important. And again, Florida being identified as much, not just the peninsula, but much of the southeast. When early map makers referred to the peninsula, when they called all this Florida, they called the peninsula Tequesta, or Tegesta, which is the name of a native group down in the Miami area. We have this, the Cornelius Whitfleet map from the first atlas that specialized or focused only on the New World. Prior to that time, the atlases were mixed and just kind of all-world atlases. And again, you also will see the shape of Florida changing drastically from map to map during these early times, because they really had a very hard time figuring out what Florida really looked like. Cuba, they got down pretty quickly. But Florida, you'll see, is skinny, it's wide, it's a rectangle, it's a triangle. It changed a lot. It's a bunch of islands. It really had a lot of different looks. Now we go to 1601, Antonio Herrera, and this is the first printed map. So a distinction between Velasco, which was a manuscript or hand-drawn map, first printed map with the name Bay de Tampa. And this also is a great example to show how printed maps can come to be. They are, either printed on, in the old days, woodblock or copper or steel plate, but oftentimes they are based on manuscript maps. And that's what you see. And the left is a manuscript version from from Velasco, and on the right, the printed version less than 20 years later from Herrera. Now we go into to this chart, the first comprehensive chart to show the Gulf of Mexico from 1646. And then this is a kind of a fun little oddity almost. We have that in the next section, but I'll ask the question, one, how do you navigate with a flat map on a spherical surface? And that's the rhumb lines and all those different things that you see on maps. But then how do you make a globe, a sphere, out of flat pieces of paper? Well, this is how they used to do it, and maybe still today. They use what are called globe gores, or sections that they would cut out of paper that, when cut along that line, see how the bottom's kind of curved, the top's curved, and of course the sides kind of has that kind of cone shape. When it's cut and pasted onto the globe, made of either wood or plaster or something like that, you can continue to do shapes like pieces of paper like that all around that surface, and you can make that flat paper apply to a round surface. Really pretty smart when you think about it. And now we go on to the Hohmann map, and again, Florida is basically is the whole southeast. And this isn't, just because they wanted to call it that. A lot of this, as Tom said, is political. The more area that particularly the Spanish can show has the name Florida on it, the larger their claim. When Ponce de Leon arrived here and claimed Florida for Spain in 1513, he claimed the whole land. Whatever the land was that he was attached to, that was Florida. And the English and French and Dutch and others began to chip away, or certainly want to chip away at that. And so you even see that here. By the 1700s, of course, you have the English colonies along the Atlantic seaboard, but you also have the French in Canada and out west, and of course the Spanish down south. And now this, one of, I know, Tom's favorites, the Mark Catesby. And it's significant because of Catesby, who was Audubon 100 years before Audubon as a naturalist, but also it has one of the most beautiful cartouches of any map in the collection. Its depiction of Florida, not so good, but you can't have everything. And now, back to this kind of significance. This is an incredibly significant chart. This is the first chart to focus solely on Tampa Bay, and I will turn it. I will say I'll turn it. Turn it. There we go. So you can see north now at the top. This is the Hillsborough River. This is South Tampa, the Inner Bay Peninsula, Pinellas Peninsula here. So Hillsborough Bay, like we are right there. Old Tampa Bay, Large Tampa Bay. This was created by Francisco Celi in 1757. The Spanish were finally at a position to try and maybe even establish a colony here at Tampa Bay. They were in desperate need for trees or naval stores for ship repair and ship construction, so that's why all these trees are located or noted here. But unbeknownst to them, the Spanish were on the verge of losing Florida to the English, so they couldn't follow through with the plans that they had had. Speaking of the English, this is an English map of West Florida. When the English took over Florida in 1763, it was so big that they divided it in two. East Florida being the peninsula, West Florida the panhandle. And on this map, interestingly, because there's really no good reason for it other than maybe they wanted to highlight it, there is an inset of Tampa Bay again. And it was, again, had north oriented to the left, so I just enlarged it and spun it here for you all to see. Very accurate map of the bay, actually, from 1766. A less accurate map, but very, very important map of Florida, the William Stork new map of East Florida. And this is critically important because of this part right here. One, this is the only copy, only color copy in the world. There's actually a black and white copy or uncolored copy at the British Library, but it doesn't have this. William Stork actually dedicated this map to the first Earl of Hillsborough, the person for whom Hillsborough River here and over on the East Coast in Hillsborough County, of course, are named. This was given to the first Earl of Hillsborough in the 1760s, and it remained in the family until the 1950s when the, I believe, fourth or fifth Earl of Hillsborough came here with his family to experience Tampa and Gasparilla in the mid-1950s, and he came bearing a gift, this map, which he gifted to Hillsborough County. So this is in the county collection, which we are the caretakers for. A very important map of the Gulf Stream. Benjamin Franklin did a lot of research on the Gulf Stream, and his not brother-in-law, who was his cousin. See here, his cousin, also was a whaler, and they were very interested in the Gulf Stream, and so they created this map, one of the earliest maps to outline the Gulf Stream. And now, early American maps. We have a few globes in the collection. This globe was printed created in 1819 when Florida became kind of the process for Florida becoming a U.S. territory through the Adams on East Treaty. He kind of jumped the gun a little bit, the guy who did this, because the treaty wasn't ratified for 2 more years. But that never stopped these map makers from churning out maps, which we'll see a couple more of those examples in a little bit. A wonderful map of the boundary between Georgia and Florida drawn by Andrew Ellicott, who did a lot of other very important survey work in the country before and after his time, really outlining that boundary, which is still the boundary today between Georgia and Florida. Oops, can't skip that one. This beautiful map, which we have a copy in the collection, but unfortunately it's not as colorful, but this is an incredibly rare, one of only 5 or 6 in the world, wall map, the first wall map of Florida, and also the first map of Tallahassee, which is this inset, printed by Isham Searcy in 1829, just 5 years after Tallahassee became the territorial capital. The seat of war map. There was, of course, several wars fought in Florida against the Seminoles for removal. This is the most important of them. The maps, the McKay-Blake map from 1839. Map making was critically important for the military in fighting the war because we really had no sense of what the interior of Florida looked like. The coastline, they, of course, had down over the past couple hundred years, but the interior was still very much unknown. So having these military maps were really, really important. And also, surveying for civilian purposes, critically important. So this is probably the first map printed of Florida after it achieved statehood in 1845. And you can see with these lines here, this was the surveying, so you could, again, chop up the land for sale or for homesteading. Critically important part of the settlement of Florida. And then this, another one of Tom's favorites, the John Bachman map, bird's eye view of Florida. Hard to get that view without an airplane or something else like satellite, but Bachman was able to capture that image just through his own imagination. This is the very beginning of the Civil War, the summer of 1861, after the Federal blockading squadron had established itself around the Florida Peninsula. Transportation maps. Tom mentioned railroad maps, but we also have maps of the canal that was attempted to be cut across Florida over the course of hundreds of years. It wasn't until the 60s, 1960s, that they finally abandoned the attempt at the cross-state barge canal. But this is one from 1888. Again, Tom mentioned railroad maps. We have lots of railroad maps because even sometimes twice a year, they would add a little more color because the line had gotten a little bit further south. They also are interesting because the plant system, you'll see here, looks like the only rail system in the state. And here, the East Coast system, the Flagler system, looks like it's the only system in the state. They don't really highlight each other's railroads very much. And then, of course, road maps. This is the very first AAA map of Florida from 1917. And then, not everybody that's transporting themselves around the state are people. We have the wildlife corridor maps as well. We have the 3 that were created to highlight the efforts of Carlton Ward Jr. and others to create the Florida Wildlife Corridor. And so, lots of other maps. Topographical maps. This is a fantastic map from World War II that, again, if you go to the collection, you can see it a little bit better, but it shows Drew Field. It shows the machine gun range that they had, the bombing range that they had, of course, the airport itself, the military field, where the different military housing was, where WAC housing was, which I'm sure the GIs wanted to know where the WAC housing was, so they'd use this map. But all kinds of different things are shown, and also it's kind of fun to see the proximity of all this stuff to our neighborhoods here in South Tampa. Soil maps, critically important to the agricultural industry here in Florida, phosphate industry. You got to know what the soil types are, and so they printed soil maps. The state did. State printed lots of different maps for lots of different reasons, and they would update them as new information or just things changed. And then sea charts, lots and lots of nautical charts. This one happens to be the Amelia Island area, so it's kind of a mix of land-based map and sea-based charting. And this is from the British period as well. And note the name here, Egmont, the namesake of Egmont Key. This was dedicated to the Earl of Egmont. And then we have these aeronautical maps from World War II as well that show for civilians, whether they're private pilots or commercial pilots, where they can, and more importantly, where they can't fly, because of all the Army air bases and naval air stations that were used for training throughout Florida. And you see, one is kind of cool because it's a restricted map, so not everybody could use it originally or see it. There's caution areas, restricted areas, defense zones, all kinds of different things that pilots had to be aware of as they're flying around Florida. And then we have maps that aren't really even maps. We have these trade cards that were from tobacco and coffee companies that, it's like baseball cards, but they had them for maps as well. So we have one from a tobacco company, one from a coffee company. We have postal covers with maps on them. This one commemorates the 4th anniversary of St. Augustine from 1965. We have placemats, and so lots of placemats, believe it or not. And this one commemorates US 1, which is now A1A, which is now Jimmy Buffett Highway. And so we bought this one just last year. And then coffee cups, coffee mugs. It has a map on it. So all kinds of different things. Silk scarves. Tom just gave us 144 textiles, mostly scarves and tablecloths, so handkerchiefs, things like that, all with Florida maps on them. Bamboo tray with Florida on it. And then we have a plate with Florida. We have lots of these things, all kinds of different stuff, all with different scenes of Florida. Even an ashtray. Ashtrays, of course, not so popular anymore, but once were very, very popular. And then we have a few of those as well. And now we get to the maps with errors and other kind of interesting items. One, the Briggs map that shows California as an island. It's not in our collection, but it's a very common misnomer. If you noticed, and I didn't point it out, but on the Cortés map, it shows the Yucatan Peninsula as an island. So oftentimes they just didn't quite know, particularly with peninsulas, if they were islands or if they were part of a larger landmass. You have this one from 1836 that shows the new county of Dade up here. Because why would it be down there if the Dade battle occurred up here? And so Thomas Bradford wanted to be, kind of first one on the block to have the new map out, so he just assumed where Dade County was going to be. And it's really fun because you can see other map makers copied him. And so there's a guy named Henry Tanner. He published a map after this that also has Dade County up there. You also will notice, and Tom pointed this out, it's hard to see, but this is the very not Chamber of Commerce named Mosquito County. Orange County was originally called Mosquito County, but literally they realized no one's moving here. We should call it something else. And so what they first were going to call it, actually, and I'll go to it really quick, was Lee Reed County. I'll go back. This is right there, Lee Reed County. Lee Reed was a state official who got into several different duels and eventually was assassinated by the family of the guy he killed in a duel. And so that didn't stick as far as a change of the name from Mosquito to Lee Reed, but eventually it was changed to Orange County. But now I'll go back. We also have maps, lots of maps in foreign languages, but even maps in languages from Asia, which for this era is kind of unusual to have maps, at least as far as we know, as far as we've seen, unusual to have maps in Cyrillic or in this case in Chinese. This one is what Hernando County was called for a few years was Benton County, named for Thomas Hart Benton, who was the person who passed the Armed Occupation Act, or helped pass the Armed Occupation Act. And then he became an anti-slavery person, and so the people of Hernando took his name away, and they put it back to Hernando County. And this is Lee Reed County again. And then we have little globes. This is called a pocket globe. And so this is what gentlemen can prove that they're fancy and knowledgeable by pulling a globe out of their pocket and talking about different parts of the world. It also, kind of cool, it has a map image of celestial bodies on the inside of the case. A powder horn, one of only a handful of powder horns that have an image of Florida on it. But this one almost assuredly came from the British period of Florida because it's written in English with the British place names that they changed from Spanish in St. Augustine, so sometime between 1763 and 1783. And then if you're a garden lover, well, there's a map for you too, map for garden lovers. If you're looking for treasure, there's a map for you too. Map for treasure seekers. Particularly after World War II, treasure hunting became very popular because there's a lot of surplus scuba gear and a lot of guys with time on their hands. And so, so you see lots and lots of these, particularly in the 1960s. This is 1950. Again, maps in newspapers. Probably the slowest news day in New York City history was May 20th of 1864 when Tampa was captured, and it made it the papers up in New York. And that's what this is a map of the Tampa Bay area being captured by federal forces during the Civil War. And then bird's eye views. This one was given to us by Fraser Himes, a very rare bird's eye view of Tampa. There are lots of, not lots, but there are a handful of bird's eye views of other cities in Florida by a couple different makers. There's only one of Tampa by Andrew Koch, and this is it. From 1892, a perfect time to have a bird's eye view of Tampa, by the way, as Tampa was changing so much during that time. Davis Island, speaking of change, a map of the islands as they were being literally dredged out of the bay. So you could look at that and say, I want that piece of land there, even though when you look at it, it's underwater still. And then fishing maps. We're actually going to do a whole show on fishing maps in a few months, and this happens to be a Rube Allen map of Lake Okeechobee. And then we have big maps. The map on top is about 8 feet long. The map on the bottom is 24 feet long. We actually have a little show and tell, which I think we're going to skip, but we can show it to you guys when we're done if you're interested. But I brought a different map up here that's a mere 12 feet long, just to show you what that would look like. The map that I brought is Fort Myers. The map that we have there is Palm Beach. So you think about these long stretches of coastline. They need a big map if you're going to cover that much ground. And we have small maps, postage stamp, literally postage stamp size maps. This was issued in 1947 to commemorate Everglades National Park. And then briefly, I want to touch on the map that we have been talked about a little bit earlier, which is the Hernán Cortés map of the Gulf of Mexico. It's part of a book that was printed in 1524. So Cortés hand-wrote his letter to King Carlos V of Spain in 1521, basically explaining why he did what he did. And what he did was overstep his bounds and capture the whole of Mexico, but on behalf of the king, so the king should be happy about that. But he still took the time to write a very lengthy letter explaining this. And in addition to that, this is a front piece and the Spanish coat of arms that were printed as part of that letter, again in 1524. But as part of it was this map, which was incredibly important because, again, it depicts the Gulf, and it really depicts the beginnings of the Spanish possessions in the New World, the very beginnings of the Spanish colonization in the New World. And it, again, happened right here on our doorstep. Another important factor which relates to us directly as far as Tampa history is the king hadn't got a letter yet, basically, from Cortés. And so he sent somebody else to go find what was going on. And that somebody else was Panfilo de Narvaez. He sent Narvaez to go find Cortés, find out what's going on, and if he's overstepping his bounds, to stop him. Well, Cortés was tipped off, and so Narvaez's forces and Cortés's forces have this big clash, and ends up with Narvaez on the wrong side of a sword. He lost an eye in the battle, and he was imprisoned. And for several years, actually. Eventually got out, convinced the King of Spain that he wants to go back to the New World and capture more stuff, and that's why he came here to Florida, specifically to the Tampa Bay area, to start his entrada and his ill-fated journey through Florida. And I think that is it. But we do have one last thing really quick about it. For Tom, is one, very quickly, your favorite map, and two, mention a couple people who really stand out to you in your map collecting career.
Well, my favorite map is, for a long time, was the Bachman bird's eye view of Florida, which, as Rodney pointed out, he couldn't be there in a plane or a helicopter or even a hot air balloon. He had to have in his mind what Florida and the Southeast looked like, and he did it beautifully. And that was fortunately, I had 2 copies of this map. One is now in my son's library at home, and the other one is at the History Center. Now my favorite map is the Cortés map, thanks to Nell and Bob and others. So that's my favorite map.
All right. And then a couple people really quick.
Well,
I know
just 2 of many people I could name. Ralph Ehrenberg was the chief of the Geography and Map Division of the Library of Congress. And when he was creating a support group, maybe 25, 35 years ago, he came to me and they invited me to be on this support group for the Geography and Map Division. And he said, "You've been so successful with the Tampa Bay History Center. would you write a letter to me and tell me how to raise money because the government does not know how to do that? Since the formation of the Philip Lee Phillips Society, we have raised over $1 million to help support map purchases for the Geography and Map Division. The bad news name I will mention, and then I'll stop there, his name is Forbes Smiley, who was once a respected and very knowledgeable and liked map dealer who went rogue and began stealing rare maps from university and other libraries, New York Public Library, for example, maybe Yale, maybe, I'm not sure about Harvard, but then he would sell them to dealers as rare found maps that he had found somewhere. The dealers would buy them and resell them. I had actually bought one and had committed to buy another from a respected dealer that I've known for 40 years, and we learned after the fact that they were on the stolen list, and I gave up the maps. I got my money back, but I'm sorry we don't have the maps in the collections.
Exactly. And so now we have talked quite a bit, so now it is your turn. Do you all have any questions? And if you do, we actually have a microphone stand, so just so the questions can be recorded, if you have questions, we'd love for you to come up and ask your question here, and we will do our best to answer it or make up an answer or do whatever we have to do.
Right.
Any questions? Don't be shy.
I told so many stories that we have overshot our time.
We've overshot our time, so but if there are
we're-
some questions.
We're
we
running
have.
late.
Well, here, let me let me give you the mic so you can everybody can hear your question. Go ahead, if you don't mind. The pretty well, when you all first sat down, we had a series of maps that were on a loop, so I don't know exactly which map you saw.
There when we first sat down, and it had on the right like a design, and it was it was like an encampment, and then it had.
Oh, I bet it's the Pierre Mortier map, a 1703 map. It had like a scene on the bottom left where there's mountains and was there like a little ship battle going on as well? Nope, not that. Okay. I don't know.
If that's the one you
Anybody
mean, if that's the one you mean, Tiffy, it is
Oh, the
upstairs
cover
in
of
the
the
map
magazine.
library.
Oh, okay. Maybe it was on the magazine cover, but I don't. What was it?
No?
This one.
Oh,
This is not
that's
Florida.
not a Florida map.
Yeah.
That was,
So
that's
yeah,
from the cover of the map collector.
yeah. So not a Florida map. Okay, so I can take this over to.
This may be a out-of-the-box question, but do we know whether the native Indians ever used maps?
Well, so good question about the use of maps by indigenous people. There really wasn't a written language among indigenous people, so they wouldn't have writing on the maps. But yet there is some evidence that they did create some maps. Again, paper and printing, things like that were also less likely. But the Cortés map the information was derived in part from native sources, and so they definitely had a sense, of course, of place. And more of an oral tradition as far as getting around. But there are a couple native maps that exist, but not very many. Yes, Bill.
How many of these maps were actually originally in books, that atlases, and how many of them were just freestanding objects? Particularly your big three. Were those bound at some point?
Rodney, you are.
So yeah, how many maps, particularly the older maps, would be what called separately issued maps, which would be just kind of a loose map, or maps that have been part of an atlas or tipped into books. And well, I don't use this. I have a microphone. The answer to that is the big three. All three of them were part of books originally. One of them still in the book. The Peter Martyr map was part of a book, and that book actually was violating kind of state secrets, if you will, so that page was removed by the order of the king in 1511, 1512, and destroyed. And then any subsequent volumes of that book that were printed did not include that page. And so, but that was one that was in a book. And the Boazio also was part of a book that was a narrative of the Francis Drake voyage.
And I can't resist telling the story that on the 1601 Herrera map, which is the
yes.
first printed map on which the name of Florida,
First printed map.
first printed map on which the name Florida appears. I bought the 1601 Herrera Atlas, which included the map that you saw of Florida, except I later found out 6 months later when I was doing research that it was not the 1601 version, it was the 1622 map in a 1601 book. Somebody over the last 400 years had substituted a map for the book. So I called the dealer and said, you sold me a 1601 book and all the maps are 1601 except this one of Florida, which is the one I wanted, and it's 1622. And he said, well, you have two choices. You can send it back to me and I'll send your money back, or you can keep it and maybe someday you can find the 1601 map and put it in the book and replace the 1622 map with the 1601. And I said, that's what I'll do. That's what we did. And I later bought the map, put it in the book, and we carefully documented that for the History Center's records of that particular map did not come with the book. So.
Exactly. There's all kinds of different things. Okay, so we're going to do two. Since I'm right here, I'll get Bob, and then I'll get you right after.
Maps make wonderful gifts. Rodney, tell the audience how they can get copies of these maps.
Oh, great question. So facsimiles, so we have to be careful how the words we use. So a printed copy of a lot of the printed maps we have are originals, but facsimiles, you actually can obtain, hold the microphone, again, you can obtain through us. If you find a map that you like when you're on our website, as long as it's out of copyright, which I think by now is 1929, we will, for a very modest fee, provide you with a printed copy of that. It's not going to be the same size because we don't want to have a lot of copies that could be passed off because the way printing is now, you can hardly tell the difference. But we have a few different size choices you can make, and you can have a copy of pretty much any map that we showed you today if it's in our collection. It's a great thing, so thank you, Bob, for saying that, because it's, again, a way we can make a little bit of money for the collection. And then last question, gentleman in blue.
Are there any mythical or rumored to be existing maps that you wish you could get your hands on for Florida?
Wow. I think the question is, are there any maps that we're looking for that we don't have? And I think I would say with the acquisition of the Cortés map, that's the last big one that we didn't have. There are no maps that are out there that we wish we had and we're looking for. But as Rodney indicated, we get almost daily emails from map dealers from various, mostly the U.S., some in the UK, offering maps that sometimes include Florida maps. And if it's a Florida map we don't have, we usually acquire it. We bought one this week. We have one more we need to talk about, but we usually buy 6 or 8 maps a month to add to the collection. But I don't know of any that we don't have that we wish we had. Correction, except ones I have seen in other libraries that I mentioned. And I'm not going to be a Forbes Smiley and take it.
Yeah, exactly.
And
they're on our list.
If they're ever offered to us, we'd love to add them to the collection.
All right. And do you want to have one last parting thought before we say goodbye to everybody?
I don't know, did I?
I think you do. Your MCOS quote.
Oh, yeah. Well, 10 years or so ago, Jeff Simon, who does the Suncoast Business Journal, did an interview with me for one of his Suncoast Business Journal segments. And at the end of the interview, he said that you've spent half of your life as a map collector, and you've also been involved with other people in building a history museum. How do you feel about all of that? And I said, well, it's not often that somebody has an opportunity to do something in life that no one else has done. And I have been able to assemble this collection, which is probably the best Florida collection of maps in the world. And I've also been involved in helping to build one of the best history museums in America. How does it get any better?
And that's it. Thank you all so much.
you.